It's 5:30 in the morning, and as of right now, Boeing is a felon. That's right, Boeing, the corporation, pled guilty late last night, just before the midnight deadline, to felony charges related to fraud regarding two 737 MAX 8 crashes back in 2018 that resulted in the death of over 300 individuals. Let's get into it. Outrage has been expressed by the families of more than 300 victims after two 737 MAX 8 crashes resulted in the death of 356 individuals back in 2018, and the families have vehemently opposed the sweetheart plea deal that was just granted to the Boeing Corporation and was accepted just before the midnight deadline provided by the Justice Department late Sunday night. Now, the door was open to this felony charge after the door plug blew out on another 737 MAX earlier this year after it was found that 4 bolts were missing that should have secured that door plug. So you see, back in 2021, Boeing secured another sweetheart deal for themselves that included delayed prosecution as long as they agreed to comply by a bunch of restrictions that were given to them by the DOJ and the FAA. However, when the door plug blew out of the 737 MAX 8 on Seattle Airlines earlier this year, the families came back to the table and said, wait a minute, they didn't comply with any of the requirements of that earlier plea deal. They have breached it. And coincidentally, that door plug blew out 2 days before this would have expired and they would have been free and clear. So there's a little karma maybe at work there. Back in 2021, after 2 pilots that worked for Boeing were caught lying to the Federal Aviation Administration about a system called MCAS that had been installed on the new Boeing MAXes. You see, back in 2021, they secured this sweetheart deal that included delayed prosecution as long as they agreed to some compliance updates, and they agreed to pay $500 million in restitution to the families of 356 dead victims, and for some reason $2.5 billion in penalties to the federal government. Why the federal government was entitled to 5 times as many penalties as the families that actually lost their family members, we may never know. But Uncle Sam works in mysterious ways. As a result of the breach of that earlier plea agreement, they now have to pay an additional $487.2 million in penalties to the government. In addition to receiving oversight by an independent monitor, they must spend $455 million to strengthen compliance and safety programs, and they will be placed on supervised probation for roughly 3 years, according to the Justice Department officials. Now, some people might say that seems like kind of a stiff penalty, but if it were you or me, we would be in prison. So is it really a stiff penalty? Let's talk about why maybe not. When you're trying to determine whether or not this was a sweetheart deal, what you should know is that for any regular corporation that was convicted of a felony, they would suffer something called debarment, which means they would be barred from participating in any government contracts because it prevents our federal government from engaging in business with corporations that are not to be trusted, are untrustworthy, or have proven themselves to act in a manner that is not in accordance with the law. That is, of course, unless you are Boeing. Boeing, despite having now been convicted of a felony after breaching a prior deferred prosecution agreement, has been deemed not too big to fail, but rather too important to debar. And that means that while other corporations would not be allowed to continue to accept government contracts, Boeing is going to get an exception made so that they can keep that government subcontractor money flowing. Lawyers for the victims' families have already noticed their objection to the deal, and a federal judge still has to approve it. So there's a chance that this may not end up shaking out, although it seems like it's pretty much a done deal. Families of the deceased have expressed that they are disappointed that the Department of Justice is moving forward with what they call a wholly inadequate plea deal, despite all of the family's strong opposition to the terms of this agreement. They wanted prosecution. Stating that we are extremely disappointed that the DOJ is moving forward with this wholly inadequate deal. They go on to say that while we're encouraged that Boeing will not be able to choose their own monitor, the deal is nothing more than a slap on the wrist and will do nothing to effectuate meaningful change within the company. Many of the families are arguing that before they had to pay $2.5 billion in fines, and that did nothing to deter bad behavior, and they still didn't comply with that agreement. So why would anyone believe that giving them an additional $487 million in fines would do any more? It's literally 20% of what the original fine was, and they didn't bother to comply. Now, the one thing that is maybe a silver lining in this really horrible plea deal is that Boeing's board of directors have agreed to a meeting with the family of the crash victims as part of the agreement, something that they have been seeking for more than 5 years. Now, I know what you're thinking, Tiffany, if this is on your channel, surely it has something to do with private equity. And in fact, it does. You see, just earlier this week, Boeing announced that they have secured funding to reacquire Spirit AeroSystems for the low price of $4.7 billion. And you may be asking, well, why does that matter? Well, it's because back when the Boeing MAX 8s and 9s were first going into production, most of the production of their fuselages were being handled at a Wichita plant and another plant that Boeing owned and oversaw. However, after McDonnell Douglas bought them, they sold those plants to a private equity firm that became Spirit AeroSystems. Now, throughout the entire debacle of both of the Boeing MAX 8 crashes back in 2018 and the door plug blowout earlier this year, Boeing has repeatedly sort of cast aspersions at Spirit AeroSystems as likely being at fault. But all you really have to do is follow the money to see that if Spirit AeroSystems is at fault, so is Boeing. They're the ones that sold their own plants to private equity to save money and to offload payroll and overhead. And that has come back to bite them, because one of the things that's unique about plane development is that it takes approximately 15 years for a plane to go from concept to production to delivery. And if you look back 15 years, then you see that right after Spirit AeroSystems took over is approximately the time that these planes that crashed and the more recent planes were going into production at Spirit AeroSystems. So yes, private equity is always at the heart of it, and I will be back with a deep dive on private equity and Boeing that no one is talking about. But today, we're going to think about the families and how upset and heartbroken they must be. And then we're going to think, as usual, about the fact that once again, we have billionaires running a corporation that is part of the defense subcontractor elite. And so, yes, they're pleading guilty to fraud. But for any one of us, that would send us to prison. For them, it sends them back to more contracts and more government cash. Okay for thee, but not for me, because there is a two-tiered system of justice in America. You only get the justice you can afford, and baby, Boeing can afford it. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and we work together to fight private equity and save small businesses in your community. Don't forget to like, follow, share, do all the things, because if we want to make a difference, it's going to take every single one of us, and I am so glad you're here.